The Partnership for Public Service estimates that the federal government entered 2026 with approximately 212,000 fewer employees than it had in January 2025. That is a 9% reduction in the civilian federal workforce in a single year. The director of the Office of Personnel Management projected even deeper losses, stating that 317,000 federal employees would be shed by year's end, while the government hired only 68,000 replacements. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention lost roughly 24% of its staff. The Department of Agriculture lost more than 20,000 employees, a 22% reduction. The Treasury Department lost more than 30,000. The Department of Defense lost 60,000 civilian workers. The IRS was cut by 25%. FEMA lost 14% of its workforce. The Education Department's Special Education Office was reduced to 3 employees. And a virologist at the University of Saskatchewan told Time that the CDC is not functional. It cannot carry out any of its mission. America has no national public health agency anymore. That sentence was not written by a political activist. It was written by a scientist describing the operational status of the agency that is supposed to protect 330 million Americans from disease outbreaks, pandemics, and biological threats. And the head of the Partnership for Public Service, Max Stier, said that the loss of expertise directly harms Americans' access to critical services and will take decades to repair. Decades, not years, not a presidential term. Decades. What I am about to show you in this video is a pattern that is unfolding simultaneously across every system that Americans depend on to live. The federal agencies that inspect your food, process your taxes, respond to your emergencies, protect your savings, regulate your banks, monitor your water, maintain your infrastructure, and guarantee your retirement are being dismantled at a pace and scale that has no precedent in modern American history. And most of what is being lost cannot be rebuilt once it is gone. Not quickly, not cheaply, and in some cases, not at all. The collapse is closer than you think. And what I need you to understand is that collapse does not look like a single dramatic event. It looks like the slow withdrawal of competence from the systems you rely on every day. It looks like the phone that nobody answers at the Social Security office. The food recall that comes 2 weeks late because the inspectors were laid off. The bridge that was supposed to be repaired but was not because the engineers were let go. The disaster response that arrives 72 hours after it was needed because FEMA does not have the staff to deploy. That is what collapse looks like in a wealthy country. Not a sudden explosion, a slow disappearance. And it is already happening. And what makes this moment different from any previous round of government cuts or restructuring is that the cuts are happening simultaneously with an economic crisis, an energy crisis, and a healthcare coverage crisis. The federal government is being reduced at the exact moment when the demands on it are increasing. The Iran war requires coordinated federal emergency response capability. The oil shock requires coordinated regulatory oversight of energy markets. The inflation surge requires functioning IRS enforcement to maintain tax revenue. The Medicaid work requirement implementation requires functioning state-federal data systems. The food supply chain disruption requires functioning USDA inspection. The bird flu outbreak, which has already resulted in the culling of over 185 million birds, the largest animal disease event in American history, requires a functioning CDC and USDA workforce to monitor, contain, and manage. Every crisis that is arriving in 2026 requires the very government capacity that was eliminated in 2025. The timing is not coincidental. It is catastrophic. And the CBPP documented that the administration exceeded its own proposed targets at 9 agencies, cutting more positions than even its own budget plan called for. The administration went beyond what it asked Congress to approve, acted without waiting for Congress, and in many cases violated the funding laws that Congress had already passed. The agencies that protect your food, your health, and your money have been hollowed out from the inside. The scale of what has been removed from the federal government in the past 15 months is difficult to comprehend without walking through it agency by agency. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, had researchers fired over President's Day weekend 2025 who were involved in ongoing clinical trials, including trials related to Elon Musk's Neuralink company, the brain implant startup. DOGE agents fired FDA staff involved in evaluating the safety of a commercial product made by the man who was running DOGE. The conflict of interest is so extraordinary that it would be rejected as implausible if it appeared in a novel. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency that ensures the air you breathe and the water you drink are safe, was targeted for a 65% workforce reduction. Over 300 staff members were fired, including environmental scientists and regulatory enforcement officials tasked with enforcing the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. The IRS lost nearly 7,000 employees with plans to cut up to half of its 90,000-person workforce. An agency watchdog warned that there will likely be issues with the 2026 tax filing season as a direct result. The Department of Justice Tax Division, which the Crew report documented, generates $67 in general deterrence for every dollar allocated to civil audits and $55 for every dollar invested in criminal investigation, was targeted for decentralization that experts warned would impair the fair and consistent enforcement of tax laws. When you reduce the agency that catches tax cheats, you do not save money. You lose money, because the voluntary compliance rate that generates the vast majority of federal tax revenue depends on the credible threat of enforcement. Remove the threat and the compliance rate drops, and the revenue drops with it. The Social Security Administration announced plans to fire 7,000 employees in close regional field offices. For the 67 million Americans who depend on Social Security, the SSA field office is how they apply for benefits, resolve payment issues, replace cards, update information, and get questions answered about the most important monthly check many of them receive. Closing those offices does not eliminate the demand. It redirects it to phone lines that are already backed up for hours and online portals that many elderly Americans cannot navigate. USAID, the International Development Agency, had nearly all of its roughly 10,000 employees fired, placed on indefinite leave, or otherwise removed. Its Inspector General issued a report stating that DOGE's cuts were preventing oversight of billions of dollars in humanitarian aid, leaving taxpayer dollars susceptible to loss through waste, fraud, or theft by violent extremist groups. The National Park Service lost roughly 12% of its workforce and reported that at least 20% of its parks have been understaffed, leading to canceled programs, maintenance delays, and cuts to emergency response. Forest Service trails are deteriorating rapidly due to staff departures threatening visitor safety. The National Nuclear Security Administration, which oversees the U.S. nuclear stockpile, had 1,400 employees furloughed during the government shutdown. The agency responsible for maintaining nuclear weapons security was understaffed during an active war with Iran. And the inspectors general, the internal watchdogs, whose job is to identify waste, fraud, and abuse within federal agencies, were fired from 17 agencies on January 24, 2025. The people whose job was to catch government waste were fired by an administration claiming to eliminate government waste. Every one of these cuts removed institutional knowledge that took years or decades to develop. Everyone weakened a system that Americans depend on. And the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities documented that the administration's fiscal year 2026 budget proposed reducing staffing by about 140,000 employees overall, but that by November 2025, the administration had far exceeded those targets, cutting roughly 220,000 positions and slashing 9 agencies by more than 10%. They went further than their own plan called for. And they did it without congressional approval, ignoring the funding that Congress had appropriated for the very positions they eliminated. And the manner in which the cuts were executed was itself damaging. DOGE members gained access to sensitive systems across multiple agencies without standard security clearance processes. At the Department of Energy, Secretary Chris Wright allowed Luke Ferrator, a DOGE operative, access to DOE information systems against the guidance of the General Counsel and Chief Information Officers. DOE staff called the access a quote one and noted that Ferrator was not cleared to be on their systems. At the CDC, DOGE sought access to data that included sensitive public health surveillance information. At CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, DOGE gained access to payment and contracting systems, and CMS officials refused to say which medical and financial records had been accessed. At the NIH, DOGE members, Luke Ferrator, Rachel Riley, Jeremy Lewin, and Clark Minor had access to systems controlling finance, budget, procurement, property, and grants. And at the Department of Education, DOGE staff reportedly fed sensitive data into an artificial intelligence system to identify spending deemed not essential to operations or required by law. The AI then recommended cuts that humans executed. The decision about which federal education programs would survive and which would be eliminated was partially outsourced to an algorithm built by DOGE operatives with no background in education policy and no accountability to the public. The GSA's Inspector General is investigating allegations of fraud, waste, abuse, and misconduct in an attempted purchase of a federal facility by a relative of the GSA's acting administrator. DOGE fired FDA staff who were involved in evaluating the safety of Elon Musk's Neuralink product while Musk was simultaneously leading DOGE. The pattern is not efficiency. The pattern is capture. The agencies that regulate, investigate, and oversee the interests of the people running DOGE are being systematically weakened from the inside. And the institutional safeguards that were supposed to prevent exactly this, the inspectors general, the merit-based hiring system, the independent regulatory structure, have been disabled concurrently. 17 inspectors general fired on a single day. The merit-based civil service replaced by a system where new hires are limited to one for every 4 departures. And the career officials who remain are, in Robert Shea's words, operating under a chilling effect that discourages them from offering professional advice. The guardrails are gone, the people who built them are gone, and the people who dismantled them are now operating the systems without oversight. The infrastructure that holds this country together was designed to last until the 1970s, and nobody built what comes next. The first wave of American infrastructure was built in the 1920s during the industrial boom. Roads, bridges, water systems, and electrical grids were designed to last approximately 100 years. The second wave was built in the post-World War II boom, designed to last approximately 50 years. Both of those life cycles have run their course. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave U.S. infrastructure an overall grade of C- in their most recent report card, meaning that the systems are in mediocre to poor condition, exhibit significant deficiencies, and are at risk of failure. Over 75,000 bridges across the United States are currently classified as structurally deficient. In 2024, the average American spent 11 hours in electrical blackout, according to tracking data. The Texas power grid came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of a total collapse during the February 2021 winter storm. CSYS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published an analysis calling America's broken infrastructure a national security threat, documenting that highways built for Model T traffic are crumbling under the weight of modern freight, that old pipes in Florida are leaking millions of gallons of sewage, and that the backlog of work for U.S. highways and bridges alone exceeds $830 billion. And the United States experienced 22 weather and climate disasters with losses exceeding $1 billion each in a single year, a new record with combined costs reaching $95 billion. The infrastructure that is supposed to absorb those disasters, the levees, the drainage systems, the power grids, the communication networks, the emergency response systems, was designed for a climate that no longer exists and a population that was half its current size. And unlike previous generations, there is no third wave of grand construction on the horizon. The political system cannot agree on a bridge repair bill, let alone a generational infrastructure rebuild. The 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was the largest infrastructure bill in decades, but it addressed only a fraction of the backlog, and much of the funding has been slow to deploy because the permitting and environmental review processes that govern infrastructure projects take 7 to 10 years from approval to construction. By the time the 2021 Act funding reaches the ground, the bridges it was supposed to fix will be a decade older than when the bill was passed. The infrastructure is not failing because Americans do not know it needs to be fixed. It is failing because the political and institutional systems that are supposed to fix it have been degraded to the point where they cannot execute a repair at the scale and speed required. And the federal workforce reductions at the Department of Transportation, at the Army Corps of Engineers, at the EPA, and at the Federal Highway Administration are removing the very people who process the permits, manage the contracts, and oversee the construction that keeps the infrastructure from crossing the line between deficient and dangerous. And water is perhaps the most invisible and the most critical infrastructure failure. Water pipes in American cities were laid when jazz was still a rebellious art form in the 1920s and 1930s, using materials that degrade over time, including lead, cast iron, and asbestos cement. The American Water Works Association estimates that the United States needs to invest $1 trillion over the next 25 years just to maintain and upgrade its existing water systems. Lead contamination in drinking water has been documented in every state. The Flint, Michigan crisis of 2014 was not an anomaly. It was a preview. The difference between Flint and the next city is that Flint was caught. The cities where the lead is leaching but the testing has not been done because the EPA scientists who would have flagged the data were laid off are the cities where the crisis is invisible until children start showing developmental delays that can never be reversed. Lead exposure in children causes permanent neurological damage. There is no safe level. There is no treatment. There is no undo. And the EPA workforce that was supposed to enforce the lead and copper rule was cut by over 300 staff, including the very enforcement officers responsible for holding water utilities accountable. The first wave of infrastructure was built for 100 years. The second wave was built for 50 years. Both have expired. And the third wave, the one that was supposed to replace them, does not exist because the political system that would have to fund it has been paralyzed by debt, polarization, and a government efficiency campaign that treats every federal employee as waste to be eliminated rather than capacity to be deployed. The financial system is operating with no margin for error, and the people who are supposed to regulate it have been fired. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget published a report in March 2026 called Break Glass, a plan for the next economic shock. The title alone tells you what the most serious fiscal policy organization in Washington thinks is coming. They are not publishing reports about how to avoid an economic shock. They are publishing reports about what to do when one arrives. And their central finding was that the U.S. has never experienced an economic shock while carrying this level of debt. National debt has reached 100% of GDP, a level not seen since World War II. Interest payments on the debt have crossed $1 trillion per year for the first time in American history. And the CRFB specifically listed the failure of financial institutions as one of the scenarios they are preparing for, alongside de-anchoring of inflation expectations, loss of confidence in the Federal Reserve, a fiscal crisis caused by Treasury market turmoil, and a decline in the dollar. Every single one of those scenarios is currently more probable than at any point since the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve is under political attack. Inflation expectations, as measured by the University of Michigan survey, are surging. The dollar has weakened. Treasury market turmoil has been visible in the repo market stress since October 2025, when the Fed had to inject billions in emergency liquidity. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the agency created after 2008 specifically to protect consumers from predatory financial practices, had roughly 200 workers let go. The FDIC insurance limit has been frozen at $250,000 since 2010, eroding by 31% in real terms. Commercial real estate is sitting on approximately $1.2 trillion in maturing loans that will need to be refinanced at much higher interest rates over the next 2 years, threatening the regional banks that hold those loans. And the banking regulators who are supposed to monitor those risks, stress test those banks, and intervene before failures become systemic have been weakened by the same workforce reductions that hit every other federal agency. The people who are supposed to catch the next SVB before it collapses are the same people who were fired, furloughed, or demoralized by 15 months of DOGE cuts. Robert Shea, a former OMB official from the George W. Bush administration, told Federal News Network that the workforce changes have had a chilling effect on leaders across the career civil service. Many career officials are now more cautious about how, when, and whether they offer professional advice, particularly when that advice could be perceived as resistance rather than implementation. In plain English, the people who are still in government are afraid to raise alarms because raising an alarm might cost them their job. And when the people inside the system are afraid to sound the alarm does not sound until the building is already on fire. And the consequences of this regulatory hollowing are not theoretical. In 2023, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed after regulators failed to act on warning signs that had been visible for months. The 2008 financial crisis was preceded by years of deregulation and regulatory capture that allowed banks to accumulate risks that the weakened oversight agencies could not detect or prevent. Every financial crisis in modern American history was preceded by a period of regulatory weakening. Every single one. And the current period of regulatory weakening is the most aggressive, the most rapid, and the most ideologically driven in American history. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which returned $17.5 billion to consumers in its first decade through enforcement actions against predatory lenders, had 200 workers removed. The DOGE tax division, which generates $16 in revenue for every dollar spent on criminal convictions, was targeted for decentralization. The SEC, the agency that is supposed to police insider trading like the $580 million in oil futures trades placed 15 minutes before a presidential statement, is operating with reduced enforcement capacity. And the banking regulators at the OCC, the FDIC, and the Fed itself have experienced the same chilling effect that Robert Shea described, where career officials are afraid to offer professional advice because it might be perceived as resistance. The financial system is not safer because there are fewer regulators. It is more dangerous. Because the same risks that caused the last crisis, excessive leverage, concentrated exposure, regulatory arbitrage, and executive hubris are all present in the current system. The commercial real estate time bomb, the $1.21 trillion in credit card debt at 22.76% APR, the auto loan delinquencies at financial crisis levels, the student loan delinquencies at record pace, the bank exposure to a Strait of Hormuz disruption that nobody stress tested because nobody expected a war that closed 20% of global oil supply. The system is more fragile than it was in 2007, and the people who are supposed to detect the fragility have been removed from the system. And the CRFB's _4 report listed the specific scenarios they are preparing for: failure of financial institutions, de-anchoring of inflation expectations, loss of confidence in the Federal Reserve, a fiscal crisis caused by Treasury market turmoil, panic over high levels of debt, a decline in the dollar, black swan events such as a natural disaster, war, or collapse of a major industry. Read that list again. Financial institution failure is a risk with 2,000 regional banks exposed to commercial real estate losses. Inflation expectations are de-anchoring, with the University of Michigan's measure at all-time highs. Confidence in the Federal Reserve is being systematically undermined by a criminal investigation of its chair and explicit political pressure to cut rates. Treasury market turmoil is visible in the repo market stress in the $97 billion New York Fed injection since December. Panic over high levels of debt is reflected in the 3 credit rating downgrades. The dollar has weakened measurably since the Iran war began, and the war itself is the black swan event they listed as a category. Every single scenario on the CRFB's crisis preparation list is currently either active or imminent, and the federal workforce that would coordinate the government's response to any of those crises has been reduced by 220,000 people. The break glass report is not theoretical. The glass is cracking, and the hammer that was supposed to break it in case of emergency has been laid off. What is disappearing cannot be rebuilt in any time frame that matters for the people who need it now. There is a concept in organizational management called institutional memory. It is the accumulated knowledge, expertise, relationships, and operational understanding that exists in the minds of the people who have been doing the work for years or decades. Institutional memory cannot be written down completely. It cannot be stored in a database. It cannot be transferred through a training manual. It lives in the people. And when the people leave, the memory leaves with them. When 24% of the CDC's workforce departs, the agency does not just lose 24% of its capacity. It loses the specific knowledge of which surveillance systems need manual intervention during flu season, which state health departments have reliable data and which need verification, which international partners have real-time access to outbreak data and which have a 48-hour lag, which laboratory protocols work in the field and which only work in controlled conditions. That knowledge existed in the minds of the people who were laid off. It walked out the door with them. And the replacement hires, if there are replacement hires, will take 5 to 10 years to develop the equivalent depth of operational understanding. The same is true at every agency. The IRS agents who understood the most complex tax evasion schemes are gone. The EPA scientists who could identify contamination patterns in groundwater data are gone. The FEMA coordinators who knew which local emergency managers to call in each county are gone. The USDA inspectors who knew which processing plants had compliance issues are gone. The Forest Service rangers who maintained the trails in the most visited national parks are gone. The SSA caseworkers who helped elderly Americans navigate the benefit system are gone. And the inspectors general who were supposed to catch fraud, waste, and abuse are gone. Each departure is individually small. Collectively, they represent the largest voluntary destruction of government capacity in American history. And the Partnership for Public Services Max Stier said something that should be heard by every American who depends on any federal service for anything. He said, as challenging as 2025 was, I think we can expect even harder days ahead in 2026. Harder days ahead. From the organization whose entire purpose is to make government work better. And the reason the days will be harder is that the cuts are cumulative. The agencies that lost 10% of their staff in Q1 2025 lost another 5% in Q2 and another 5% in Q3. The remaining staff are demoralized, overworked, and afraid. The new hires who are supposed to replace them are not being hired because the government has adopted a policy of hiring one new employee for every 4 who leave, which means the workforce shrinks by 75% of every departure, permanently. And the services that depend on that workforce degrade accordingly. Not in a press release, not in a headline. In the wait time on the phone, in the weeks between filing a claim and receiving a response, in the inspection that does not happen, in the bridge that does not get repaired, in the contamination that is not detected, in the fraud that is not caught, in the disaster that is not prepared for. The collapse is not coming. The collapse is the accumulation of 10,000 small failures, each one invisible in isolation, each one compounding the next, until the system that was supposed to hold cannot hold anymore. And the Americans who depend on that system, which is every American, will discover what was lost only when they need something that is no longer there. The phone rings. Nobody answers. That is what disappearing looks like. And once it disappears, it does not come back on a timeline that matters to the person who needed it today. And what haunts me most about this moment is that the people who are losing these services are overwhelmingly the people who have the least ability to replace them privately. When the CDC is not functional, the wealthy can afford concierge medicine and private health consultants. The poor cannot. When the IRS is not processing returns efficiently, the wealthy have accountants who navigate the delays. The poor wait months for refunds they depend on to pay rent. When FEMA is understaffed, the wealthy have insurance, savings, and the ability to relocate. The poor have a flooded house and a phone number that nobody answers. When the SSA closes field offices, the wealthy have financial advisors who handle their retirement planning. The 67-year-old widow on fixed income who needs to resolve a benefits issue has a 2-hour drive to the nearest remaining office and a 4-hour wait when she arrives. Every service that is being cut is a service that the most vulnerable Americans depend on the most, and the people cutting those services will never personally experience the consequences of the cuts because they are wealthy enough, connected enough, and insulated enough to replace every federal service with a private alternative. The system is being dismantled by people who do not need it at the expense of people who cannot live without it. And the gap between those two groups is the gap that defines the collapse. Not the collapse of the economy, not the collapse of the markets, the collapse of the social contract that said if you pay your taxes, follow the rules, and contribute to the system will be there when you need it. That contract is being broken, quietly, systematically, agency by agency, employee by employee, office by office, until the system that was supposed to catch you when you fell is no longer there, and you discover it only when you fall.